first unit of Term 2 is the Wild Wild West. I've said this throughout the beginning of this unit that as a young boy, playing cowboys and Indians was a big deal to me. Watching the old westerns was a big deal to me. And I spend more time on the West than some of the other U.S. history classes do, because that's what I grew up with. We're going to look at the railroad. We're going to look at Native American culture. We're going to look at some of the Native American wars. We will look at the mining industry. We will look at the cowboys themselves and what makes a cowboy, and then where the disconnect is. Because the cowboy has become part of a American mythology, if you will. And then finally we'll look at we'll look at the lumber industry, the timber industry that grew up in the West, and the frontier settlement, the farming aspect of the West. And with that, we'll see some of the political changes that come. The populist movement that will be part of next unit has its origins in the Western farmers. So we'll spend a little time with that. The growth of the railroad is going to be a topic we cover in the next 2 units. So we're going to have some crossover. So we'll spend a little more time with the transcontinental next unit. But we do want to talk about it because the train is going to be a big part of this connection between East and West. May 10th, 1869 is the formal ceremony completing the Transcontinental Railroad. It's the big ceremony. You've probably seen pictures, and I think there's a picture on the cover of your notes. I've got the picture out on the board as well. The 2 trains sitting there, kind of face to face, and there's a big photo op with the different people. And they had a ceremony. There were speeches. There was a golden railroad spike driven into as the last spike driven. But when you remember, the railroad actually, the process started in 62. So they had one big ceremony there in 69. It took several years to build. And you got 2 different railroad companies. One is the Union Pacific. It was moving from Omaha, Nebraska, moving west. And then you get the Central Pacific, which was coming from Sacramento and heading east. By 1885, we've got 4 different transcontinental lines. And we talked about the government subsidies, and there's some stuff in your reading as well. But the government subsidies aspect, railroad companies were given this enticement. If you build your railroad through this region, we will give you X number of acres. It was usually like every mile of track there were 640 acres given to the railroad, things of that nature. The use of immigrant labor, the Chinese, the Irish, depending on which direction you're coming. If you're coming from the east, it tended to be heavy Irish. And then also African American, heavy former slave. And then from the west to the east, you had a lot more of the Chinese labor. We watched the Heartland episode of The Story of Us right about the time that we covered this material in class. That is on YouTube. I shared that the access to that video on the blog. That gave us more information than we're going to give in the notes. So you do need to watch that to get some of the information about the Transcontinental Railroad, the cost as far as the lives are concerned. And like I said, we'll spend a little bit more time with the Transcontinental Railroad next unit. Cowboys and Indians. Grew up playing the game. And like I said in class, I don't ever really remember anybody wanting to be an Indian. We all wanted to be the cowboy. Watching the old westerns growing up as a kid, it was easy to determine who the good guy was and who the bad guy was. And more times than not, they painted the Native American as the savage, and the good guy was always the cowboy. But when you start looking at what really happened in the settlement of the West, it's less about cowboys versus Indians, and it's more about Indians versus America. And that'll play out with the cavalry more than anything else. This mentality of we have to defeat the Native American to settle the region, that goes back to our earlier history. When we showed up here in 1607, if we couldn't get the land we wanted the way we wanted it, we would fight them for it. We fight them, we move them, we sign treaties, then we find something there we want. We fight them, we move them, we sign another treaty. Then we fight them, we move them, we sign another treaty. And all along the while, we both break the treaties. I mean, if you're the Native Americans, why would you trust a treaty, signed by the American government? Because we have no history of fulfilling our end of the obligation. Now, the Native Americans broke treaties as well, and that was going to be the excuse for a lot of whites to break the treaty. But the reservations just weren't going to work initially, because it's all about the food, it's all about the culture, because we weren't just asking them to relocate to a specific piece of land, we were asking them to stop their nomadic culture. I mean, the Plains Indians, since the introduction of the horse, had been a nomadic people. They had roamed, they'd followed these massive, bison herds across the plains. And when you were asking them to give that up, you were asking them to give up who they were. That was going to be a problem. The idea of boundaries, the idea, again, bison don't follow maps. They're big, beautiful, majestic creatures. You all should know by now that I have an affinity for bison. I like them. It was my high school mascot. But the reality is, they're not smart enough to read a map. Of course, they weren't smart enough to not run off a cliff whenever they were ran that way by the Indians in the early hunts. But that's a different video altogether. With the cowboys and the Indians, and with the Native American culture itself, we did watch a couple of different videos. One of them was the Native American Tech, which covered some of the battles, but also covered some of the cultural things about the teepee, the technological things, the use of dogs, the use of the horses, and the like. If you weren't here for the day we watched that video, you really need to make arrangements to come in. The second video we watched was last Friday. That's an old VHS tape I've got called Extreme History Bison Hunts, and that was the short 25-minute video. A little more colorful than the other, but Roger Daughtry kind of taking us through the buffalo hunt, and you can see him crawling around with a wolf's hide on his back and trying to shoot blunt tip arrows at bison as they begin dusting, and he had to make a run for it. And then it also talked about the war paint and different things. You got to see them make a Indian canteen out of a bladder. Showed you how they made arrowheads out of bone. Interesting video. Again, if you didn't see it, you need to make some kind of an arrangements to come and watch that. There are any number of Indian battles or Indian wars, if you want to call them that, we could choose to talk about during this unit. And the three that I picked are the Sand Creek Massacre, Custer's Last Stand, also known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Wounded Knee. With Sand Creek, notice the date, the names are there for you, John Shivington and Black Kettle, those are the people involved. Sand Creek Massacre is dealing with the Cheyenne. And Black Kettle's camp, they were on the Sand Creek reservation. They had been given an American flag to fly over their encampment. The idea of that is, if you were flying the American flag, that meant that you had signed the treaty, you were under the protection of the American government. They had given in, they're on the res, and that was supposed to be sufficient to allow them to be left alone. But instead, Shivington and members of the Colorado cavalry are going to attack their encampment on November 29th, 1864, killing well over 200 members of this reservation encampment. The stories that come out of this, whenever they first started talking about going to this battle or attacking this reservation, there were some members of some of the officers said that hold on, they've signed a treaty, we can't attack them, and Shivington blew up. He got very frustrated with them and talked about scalps were what they're after. He longed to be wading in gore, that he believed it was his God-given right to kill Indians with any means necessary. He had an agenda, and we talked about this in class, the idea that he had a political agenda. He wanted to be, governor of Colorado. He wanted to go to Washington. He wanted to use this victory to catapult some other career. But the brutality, the severity, the savagery that our troopers used, and when they attacked, stories were going to come out. And with the subsequent investigation, stories about slashing open pregnant squaws with fetuses laying next to them, taking target practice on a small child that had survived the initial attack during the day 2 of the cleanup, where they just were trying to shoot this little boy at 75 yards. A little girl who walked out with a white flag was cut down, and just the bodies were mutilated. Far beyond any kind of savagery you could expect from the stories you've been told about Native Americans. Because again, that's for me has always been the eye-opening aspect of Sand Creek, is that most Americans believe that the Native Americans were the savages, that the Indians were the savages. But in this situation, it was most definitely the white soldiers that were acting in a savage manner. And the story about White Antelope having his privates cut off, and they were bragging about going to use that for a tobacco pouch and things like that. I don't know how you justify that as a military campaign expedition of any kind against a group of people who were flying the American flag, which they had been told protected them. I mean, when we've talked about other Native American groups, especially when we were talking about Tippecanoe Creek and the Shawnee Prophet, Wallalithika, and when he told the warriors they'd be bulletproof, we laughed at him. We said that was funny to believe that they thought that their mystical powers made them bulletproof. Well, from this point forward, the Cheyenne, any protection, let's fly this flag and it will protect you. Well, that was about as crazy as Wallalithika saying those people were bulletproof. They have no reason to trust any soldier, any government agent, because they trusted, they signed the treaty, they fly the flag, and this is what happens to them. Throughout the 60s and into the early 70s, the reservation system is going to be used. They're going to be gathering up Indians, putting them on reservations, but the problem is we always seem to find something in that reservation that we wanted. And with the Dakotas, where the Cheyenne and Sioux are going to be, it's gold. It's Black Hills gold. And eventually they're going to be moved again. And early 1870s, 72, 73, we started seeing more and more of these natives willing to walk off the res. And by 1876, there's going to be a fairly large group of Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, the Ogallala, the Hunkpapa, Umpapa, whatever, the different groups they were, had left the reservations, and the United States military believes it's their job to go out and get them and bring them back in. And this is where we get the culmination of Custer's last stand. George Armstrong Custer, he's a colonel, head of the 7th Cavalry for a good period of this, is going to lead his force of 280-odd men, attacking part of this camp where he thought he was going to the end of the camp, and instead he was attacking the middle. Really had no idea what he was going up against as far as numbers. The reconnaissance wasn't good. He doesn't have a lot of supplies. He didn't take the Gatling guns he had been offered. In fact, he'd had over 500 men, and he split them and sent one group around the other side of the hill, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn on the backside of Little Bighorn. And when he attacked, he ends up being slaughtered. His men pretty much all wiped out. I mean, that's the story's always been, that there were no survivors. Accounts vary that there's been one or two where scouts were sent for supplies and reinforcements that did survive, but for most intents and purposes, you've got 280 some odd troopers killed laying alongside this hill. Shared the story, the idea that I think it was in Evan S. Cannell's book, Son of the Morning Star, where it talked about the bodies, were summarily. It's the tradition, we've talked about with the Native Americans. We watched the different videos. The mutilation of the body that they do typically has a symbolic purpose. They would slash under the arms so they couldn't lift arms against them, things like that. When they went to, and then scalped, when they went to cut Custer, the Cheyenne women stopped him because supposedly he had fathered a child with a Cheyenne woman, which made him quote-unquote family. And instead of mutilating his body, instead they took their sewing awls and jammed them into his ears. And the whole idea behind that is that he would listen better, he would hear them better, because he'd been warned if he ever made war with the Cheyenne, he would be, they would all die. Timing of Custer's last stand is significant because it's right before the bicentennial. As news was filtering back east from this, it's going to take several days to get the full accounts and reports and all that back, and so we're going to be getting into that centennial celebration. If I said bicentennial earlier, I apologize. It's the centennial celebration. It's our 100th birthday. That's not going to be good for the Native Americans, because what's going to happen is you start to see that switch is going to be flipped for those Americans, the more moderate and peaceful Americans who didn't want an aggressive, bloody Indian war because they just come out of the Civil War. But now you've got 300 soldiers brutally murdered on the side of the hill. Now the people aren't going to care how they got there. They aren't going to care that they were chasing down the Indians trying to end their way of life. What they care about are these savage Indians murdered and left these people, their bodies stripped and mutilated. All of a sudden, it's going to be American Indian policy to every Indian on the reservation, or we're going to kill them. That becomes what happens on the plains. So they kind of have a blank check from the American people to do whatever you have to do to go get the Native Americans. Finally, we've got the Battle of Wounded Knee up there, and it's up at Wounded Knee. It's on the reservation. There started to be a resurgence, a revival on the Wounded Knee, up at Wounded Knee. They were doing the ghost dance. They were trying to summon the buffalo back. They were trying to go back to the old ways. And we watched that little video clip in class, and it talked about how they started to make their war shirts that they believed were bulletproof, and that freaked out the white people. Because if you're making a shirt that you think is bulletproof, you're probably going to try to do something with it. So they brought in the military, and the military tried to disarm them. And in the process of disarming the military, shots going to be fired. And the military had brought some artillery pieces with them, some Hotchkiss guns, 4 of them. And they opened fire. And in the end, you ended up with about 300 Native Americans dead. And Wounded Knee is typically remembered as the final Plains Indian War. And it's not much of a war. Again, they just started firing that artillery into the camp, killing women and children, and men, women, and children both. But it sounds, the women and children weren't the ones that were protesting the taking of their guns, but yet the military opened fire anyway. And this was really the end of the fighting that took place with the Plains Indians. As far as the military outpost, I like to think of this as throwing some comparisons with the good old-fashioned medieval Europe, where the castles existed, settlements would form. And the same thing happened here with these military outposts. Whenever there was a military outpost or there was cavalry, towns were going to kind of evolve around it. It's the safety aspect. And once you got into the plains, deep into that territory, you get into the 1880s, and then in the 1890s, not really a lot of issues with Native Americans per se, and it's more about communications, making sure the roads were good, and making sure that there was protection for settlers against, any kind of unrest, protecting, the mail to coming through, the stagecoaches, those types of things, making sure, supply wagons and, those caravans that were coming from the east, the railroad, that kind of stuff would be protected. As far as the government treatment of the Indians, once you got them on the reservations, they were under the control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Got there notorious for corruption and bribery, which is pretty much true of this entire period, the 1870s, 80s, into the 1890s. Very corrupt within our government, and it kind of coincides with some of the problems with Reconstruction. There was a lot of government money being spent on feeding the Indians. Well, that means there's government contracts, and sometimes there were some unscrupulous people that were in charge of these contracts. So, you may give the contract to the company that gives you the best deal, but may not be supplying the Indians with the best supplies. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to have its issues, and it's going to move between the War Department, or the Department of the Army, particularly within the War Department, and the Bureau and the Department of the Interior. And anytime you're moving an agency between departments, things are missed. The Dawes Act, which is the Dawes General Allotment Act, which dealt with it was an attempt to assimilate the tribes, bring them into become more American. They got Americanized there, which is again the idea of assimilation, making them like us. It was a way of redistributing the reservation lands to individuals. The numbers, you were able to give something like 160 acres to each Indian family, plus there was acreage for grazing and the like. If they were 320 acres for grazing. And then whatever was left over, once all the Native Americans and the res and the land is parceled out, whatever was left over, then they could potentially sell for a profit to anybody and everybody. Well, what's going to end up is by the 1930s, and again, I'm jumping ahead, 45, 50 years, but within the next half century, about 2/3 of the land that had been set aside will then be in the hands of whites. So even once again, even on the reservation, we're going to take advantage and get the best land for ourselves. There's also some attempts at educating the Native Americans on the off-reservation boarding schools. We would bring in the Native Americans, especially the males. We would cut their hair. We would teach them how to speak English. And in some cases, they would be punished if they tried to speak in their native languages. We forced them to learn American cultures, American history, American heritage, American holidays, and things like that, to the point when they returned to the reservation, they didn't fit in. And the problem is, when they went into the quote-unquote white world, they were still seen as Native Americans. They were seen as Indians. They were seen as savages. They don't fit in there either. So we did create, kind of a generation of Native Americans here that don't really fit in either place. Indian policy has always been disastrous because, in general, going back to the 1600s, it was treaties that were violated, followed by treaties that were violated, followed by treaties that are violated. And yeah, you could make the argument that both sides did violate some of these treaties, but we all know that that's just, a way for us to cope. It's a way for us to rationalize it. The way we violated the treaties were typically much worse than the way they violated them. Mining is going to be another one of the aspects of the West. We've already talked about the 49ers. We've talked about the big gold rush out in the Sutter's Mill out in Northern California. The 49ers are going to do what they do. They're going to get California to statehood. But what happens after that is, as it says there, we're going to see an advance eastward rather than westward. We start settling backwards to a certain extent. And a lot of this is following the various gold rushes. We're going to see gold strikes in Idaho. We're going to see gold strikes in Colorado and Wyoming and Arizona, New Mexico. And some of it's not gold, some of it's silver. In Nevada, we had the Comstock Lode, which was the single largest silver and gold strike in American history. I mean, they hit a vein. I mean, they hit the $500 million lotto, if you will, with their 250 $250 million strike with gold and silver back then. The problem with this is all these individual prospectors and miners that would make their way to these places, there wasn't enough money in it for them. Because once you get past, a lot of the nuggets and the flakes that you're going to find when panning for gold, i.e., placer mining, that individual process that we've talked about before. The problem is the real gold is going to be embedded in quartz, and that's where it took the machinery. It's going to take capital. It's going to take money, and it's going to be the industries. It's going to be the big business guys out east that are going to have the money to invest. That will then make the real money in mining. Whenever a strike would happen, first of all, if there was a nice strike, miners tried to keep that stuff a secret, but the reality is word was going to spread, people were going to find out, and if it was a big enough strike, then a boomtown was probably going to happen. And when we're talking about boomtowns, we're not talking about the fireworks stores down in Missouri. We're talking about mining towns, and it's the boom of the economic boom that was happening because of the mines. So as people follow the strikes, miners are going to come, cities develop, and then once the mine has run its course and the gold stops being found or the silver is not there anymore, then people who flocked to the town because of the mine will leave just as quickly, and that's where a lot of our ghost towns from the Old West came from. Those mining towns that just couldn't make it. They relied completely on the mine and never found any other industry or anything else that could bring in money. But typically in these mining towns, the company that owned the mine, they tended to control things. It could be economically. They could just own a lot of the businesses in town. They were the biggest employer in town. Because of that, they carried a lot of political power. But they usually were the law and order. Whether they had their own sheriff that they paid for, their own security force that handled things, or they just used their political influence to get things they wanted done with the elected officials, which does happen. One of the things we do, we also talked about is one of the givens. You go to a mine, or if you hear about the strike and you're a miner and you try to go in and you're taking your chance to move there where the mine's at, and you're going to strike it rich and all that, you're taking a chance. But there was a way to make money in these mining towns, which was a little bit safer of a bet, and that's dealing in the supplies, dealing in the things that the miners and the mining companies are going to need. Shovels, picks, axes, buckets, wheelbarrows. Those types of supplies, the clothing, the boots, the work gloves, those things, as well as food, shelter, lodging. If you could deal in those areas in these mining towns, you had a better chance of making a consistent living. In some cases, there's some real American success stories. Levi Strauss, German Jewish immigrant, came to the United States 1830s. Will end up out in California in the mining camps, and initially tried to make wanted to be rich, discover gold and do all that, but will eventually make a name for himself by making pants out of really thick, heavy canvas. He saw there was a need there, and he supplied that to those miners. Eventually added the rivets, and from there they'll move from the canvas to the denim. We talked about in class the reason why the denim was dyed blue. Blue was the cheapest dye, and they didn't want to sell. They weren't going to use a light colored fabric for this heavy duty labor for the miners and the like, because it just shows dirt more. But Levi Strauss goes from selling stuff to miners and mining camps out in California to being, the head of this major, national clothing company. J.C. Penney started out as a sales clerk in a dry goods store out in Wyoming. Was very good at his job. His employers liked him so much they made him part owner in another store, and then they made him part owner in a second, and then a third. And before you knew it, J.C. Penney was part owner in several stores these dry goods stores known as the Golden Rule stores. From there, he ends up owning something like 700 of them. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but owning several of these stores outright, and eventually they changed the name from Golden Rule to J.C. Penney. But again, he starts out as a sales clerk, making his money off of these miners, selling them the products they needed, and turned it into his own little economic dynasty, if you will. Okay, here we go. I should have been a cowboy. Again, I tell the story every year that I used to wear the cowboy stuff all the time as a kid. The dingo boots, the chaps, the vest, the hat, the scarf. I had gloves that matched. I had the six guns, and I had some really. I wore this to school as a kindergartner. Everything except the guns. I wasn't allowed to wear guns. I did wear spurs though. But that image of the cowboy was something that overwhelmed me as a kid. It was America. I was a Cowboys fan growing up as a little kid because they were America's team, the Dallas Cowboys, and the cowboy was just that iconic image. But the reality is that the iconic image, while we look at the persona of the all-American cowboy, it's the Marlboro Man, it's John Wayne, it's the majority of them aren't. Well, I shouldn't say the majority aren't, but significant numbers of them weren't white, but yet they were never portrayed as anything but white in the movies. And so much of the culture is actually Hispanic. I've got there on the lariat, the corral, rodeo, the term chaps from Chaparros, beef jerky from Cherokee, buckaroo comes from vaquero, bronco comes from the term for rough horse in Spanish. There's a lot of these origins in our all-American cowboy that actually come to us from the Mexicans and the Spanish cowboys. And we added things, the pointy-toe boots with the heels. We talked about this in class. It's the pointy toes. There's a practical thing for all this. The boots being able to slide easier into the stirrup. The heels are for there to hold your foot in the stirrup. The bandana, again, it's not just something that looks good on the outfit. It wasn't just an accessory. It was a practical thing. You could use it to strain water, to hold food. It was a rag to wipe things off. It was a bandage to bind a wound. It could be used to set tourniquets, splints. We listed several possible applications of the bandana, and then of course the six-shooter. The dealing with cattle rustlers and the like made the cowboy using a gun more of a necessity of actually having that to kind of ward off those people trying to steal your cattle and the like. We talked about the evolution of it. Samuel Colt was in the video we watched, and the early 5-shot revolver becomes a 6-shot revolver, and it's the heavy-duty weapon because they wanted it to be able to be used as a club after you were done shooting. They also made improvements to where it was easier to reload. But those were things that we added to the iconic image of the cowboy. That the cowboy hat. I even read you that piece in class where it talked about the way a hat looked actually could help you determine where a cowboy was from. The idea that a broad brim and a tall crown with the heat and the sun, a short crown and a narrow brim, it's probably northern plains where it's very windy, and you needed a hat that wasn't going to get ripped off your head with the wind and the like, or wasn't going to blow around because of the wind. But those are all parts of this iconic imagery. But we need to remember that a lot of the things that the cowboy itself, Spanish and Mexican, throw in some African American, and then American as well, and it is a combination, which makes it, I guess, more of an iconic image if you think about it as a melting pot image. It's just the way it's been portrayed over the last 100 years. It's kind of the issue. The life of the cowboy, you've got the dates there. It's the heyday. It's the 1866 to 1885. I guess one of the reasons for its, the iconic nature of this is also, this is the one thing that we have that other cultures or other, European cultures don't have. And again, we compare ourselves to Europe here, while Mexico and South American countries are also got this cowboys as part of their culture. We don't compare ourselves with them. We compare ourselves with Europe, and Europe doesn't have this. They have the knights in shining armor, but we've got the cowboy in the white hat. And one of the reasons why it's able to kind of reach this mythical stage is part of it's because of the short time that the cowboy was actually riding the plains. You got about a 20, maybe 25-year period where the cowboys were really doing this long drive stuff. The numbers there: 25% African American, 15% Mexicans. Again, significant numbers. But the books and the movies don't always portray it that way. On the cowboy's life, 10 to 14-hour days. If you're on the long drive, if you're on the quote-unquote trail, you're looking at 18-hour days. Age is probably less important than physical ability and maturity, because you got to be able to do the job. I mean, it's a tough job. I mean, bulldogging, roping, and lassoing, riding. 18 hours in the saddle. You need to have some stamina and some strength for that. Typically, it wasn't unusual for them not to own a horse, which you think a cowboy doesn't own a horse. If you're a cowboy, you work for a rancher. The rancher is going to supply you with your mount, and there's a chance that on a long drive you're going to ride multiple horses. But the idea that you probably would own your own saddle would make sense, because you are going to be spending a significant amount of time sitting in it. You're going to want something that's fits to you, it's your style, represents you, has your mark on it, whatever. Being able to ride and rope, probably not as important. Handling a gun is probably not as important as being able to ride and rope, because again, riding and roping is the job. But if you're going to need a gun, but you don't have to be able to shoot the shot glass out of the air. You don't have to be a trick shooter or anything. Stampede was always a concern. That's why prairie fires and lightning were pretty dangerous things. So you paid attention to the clouds, you paid attention to the weather. That was again a bigger concern than Native Americans. They may try to steal your horses, but they weren't big into the cattle aspect. Rustlers would be more of a concern than the Native Americans, really. The reason for the long drive is after the Civil War is over, we do see a boom in the meat market. The price was $40 a head. That's a big number back then. So if you had cattle, and again, cattle were multiplying like crazy in South Texas and Southwest Texas and Mexico. It was easy to acquire cattle there. It's very cheap to acquire, even free to acquire in some cases. If you could get that cattle to market, you could make a serious amount of money. So people were intrigued, and people are going to try. The problem with the long drive is when you're moving from Texas up into the settled areas of into Missouri, the problem is that's settled. You're going to have to go through farms. You're going to have to deal with small towns and settlements. And when you're moving the cattle, you're really just making a suggestion. You're aiming them. You're not necessarily driving them exactly where you want them to go, but you're just kind of pushing them in a general direction. And they were going to do a lot of damage. Also, when you got into the Missouri territory, you had to deal with, you got off the plains, you got into more of the woodland area, and that made it easier for cattle rustlers to set ambushes and stuff. So cowboys wanted to keep to the open range, but then you've got to figure out, I've got to get that stuff to market. Well, that's where Joseph McCoy comes in. He is going to be a businessman in Illinois, and he gets the idea that I need to go to one of these towns along the railroad, one of these railheads out in the Kansas area, and convince them that they need to buy into the cattle industry. They need to build corrals, and they need to market themselves to be a destination for the cattle drives. You get the cattle industry in there as far as the meat people coming, and Abilene was going to become that middleman where the cowboys could make their deal there, ship the cows back east to the the different butchers and the like, the meat packing places, the Chicagos of the world. And Abilene, Kansas was the first one of these railheads to really kind of buy into McCoy's idea, and Abilene, Kansas becomes our original cow town out there. And as I said, it was just one of the railheads. The railhead is just a town along the railroad, and he was trying to sell this idea, and Abilene bought, and Abilene, Kansas becomes the destination for those cowboys that were driving the cattle up the Chisholm Trail. The roundup itself begins in the spring of the year. And again, these are open range cattle, free ranging. There's no boundaries, borders, there's no fences. So your cattle may be mingled with other people's cattle. You got to go in, you got to separate. It's where the branding comes into it. You got to check, get the cows that have your brand. You got to deal with the calves. Then you got to deal with, getting them together, and you begin that drive towards the railhead. The drive itself could last as long as 3 months. Again, the time frame depends on how far south you are in Texas and what railhead you're driving to, because more than one railhead will pop up. Abilene is not going to be the only cow town, but it's just the first cow town. Typical numbers: one cowboy for 250 head of cattle, one cook, that's the chuck wagon, going to eat a lot of beans, and that's probably where we get cowboy beans. But the food is probably more than likely going to be Tex-Mex because of the region that you're coming from in Texas. And you're going to have a wrangler. He's your professional cowboy. He's the guy that's good at everything. Probably the one cowboy that is hired year-round. And then you get the trail boss. He's your money man. In the article dealing with the black cowboy, it did talk about the fact that throughout the history, that we have documentation of black cowboys pretty much holding every job that a cowboy could hold in the long drives and the like, except for that of the trail boss. They were never given the opportunity to be trail boss. But once you reach the railhead, then it becomes the business of the trail boss and the people buying and selling the meat. And the cowboy gets paid, and he's going to go to town. And this is where Abilene and other cow towns, again, this is where you also make money off this. The cowboy's been on the trail for 3 months. He's going to want a bath. Guess what? You can go to the bathhouse, get a bath, hot bath, shave, and a haircut at the barbershop. Going to be able to get cleaned up. You may need a new suit of clothes. Guess what? They've got stores for that. They're on the right on Main Street. Cowboy can go get the shave and a haircut, hot bath. He can go over here, get a new suit of clothes. Maybe he needs that new hat. Guess what? There's a place there that can sell it. That not just sell him a hat, they can make him a hat. Okay, made to fit him in his style, in his color, whatever felt he wants, and or whatever material. Maybe he needs boots, or his boots need repaired. Guess what? We got a guy who does that too. Not to mention, if you want entertainment, there's probably there's probably a dance hall. There's probably a theater. There's probably there are going to be saloons. There's going to be gambling. There's going to be hostesses, and there's going to be brothels as well. But that's where cow towns are going to be able to make that money off of the industry, is by providing those various services that would be required. I said that about 20 to 25 years is about all this is going to last, and that's really because of several factors. More people do this, the more people make money off the cattle industry, the more people are going to want to do it. There's 40 ranchers in that area, and they're making good money. Guess what? Now there's 50 ranchers. Now there's 60 ranchers. We're a copycat society. That's going to lead to, and the ranchers that are making money, they want to make more, so they're going to get more heads of cattle. And the combination of the growing number of ranchers, the growing size of the ranches, we're going to see an overgrazing. Bad weather, there's a rough winter, there's a bad summer, another rough winter, and next thing you know, the herds have dwindled. The grass is gone. And that's one of the key things for the longhorn cattle is you didn't need to buy feed. They could live and grow, these massive animals could grow and survive based on just eating grass. Okay. Other thing is the farmers, as we settle the territory, they keep moving west. That's why we couldn't do the long drives towards Missouri. because you were going through settled territory. But as those settlers begin to move west and they keep moving into these areas, they're settling land along these trails. And the cows are causing a problem. And you're going to see wars between ranchers and farmers over the use of this territory. And finally, by 1885, if you remember back to the very first slide, after the title slide, by 1885 there are 4 transcontinental railroads. So I don't think it's just a coincidence that 1885 kind of uses the end date for the cowboys and the long drives, and that number is also coinciding with when we had our 4th transcontinental railroad. The railroads just got closer, and the bigger these ranchers got, the more money that was in this, they could convince the railroads to come to them. Not just with the transcontinental line, but they're going to make spur lines and trunk lines off of that, and they're going to expand the railroad into different regions. When the railroad comes to your town, you don't really need the cowboy for the long drive anymore. You're still going to need the hired hands. You're still going to need cowboys to work your ranch, but you're not going to need them in the number that you once did. You're not going to need them for that, again, that iconic image of the cowboy moving the herd across the plains. Now, on the subject of settling the plains, again, we went through this list. There's a lot of information about this in your textbook as well. The Homestead Act passed during the Civil War. It was about encouraging people to move west. And your main idea is, talking about the government's involvement in Western settlement. They're trying to encourage people to go through cheap land and free land, because we own the territory, but yet we need to control it. And to control it, we need to have people there. And sometimes you've got to encourage the people to move into these regions. It's unsettled. It's going to be difficult, but at the same time, now it's free land. That's going to entice people. If you were a homesteader, you paid a small filing fee, $18 or whatever it was, and then you get 160 acres. You have to stay there for 5 years, and it's yours for free. You don't have to pay anything else. Problem with the 160 acres is once you move far enough west, that's not enough land. And the government's going to look at things like the Timber Culture Act. We'll give you more acres, but you plant trees. The Kincaid Act said that once you were past the 100th meridian, we'll automatically give you double the land because we know 160 wasn't enough. But the whole point of these different acts, desert land, timber stone, and again, there's a long list of land grants that are out there. These are I just put 4 of them on your notes. The point of it was to encourage settlement. The point of it was to get people to move west. Because once we got you out there, the expectation is that you will stay. The different people, you've got your homesteaders, you get your exodusters. Remember, we talked about them in class. We talked about them back with the Reconstruction. Exodusters are typically your African American, your freedmen, who don't want to move to the north and deal with the northerners in their discrimination. They don't want to stay in the south and deal with Jim Crow laws and that discrimination. They were looking for that fresh start out in the west, and guys like Benjamin Pap Singleton would be very helpful, though. He helped orchestrate the creation and building freedmen's settlements, or sometimes referred to as black towns, out in those western states, out in Kansas, out in Nebraska, and helped facilitate. He was going to be that land broker for these African Americans, these freedmen, to seek this fresh start. European settlement, Chinese settlement. Let's skip down to the Chinese. We know about them in the railroads, but we probably don't realize is they were a significant part of the gold rush as well, especially in places in California, but also into Idaho and other areas. But they brought with them their culture. They brought with them innovations. Remember, in 1492, Columbus was heading west for a reason. He was trying to get to Asia. He's trying to get to China because they had things we wanted. Well, when the Chinese immigrants come to the New World, they come to America, they're going to bring some of those innovations with them. And one of those things, they play a role in our fruit industry. I mean, personally, big fan of fruit. Okay, outside of eating red meat and bacon, I am a big fan of fruit as well. They're going to deal with the discrimination because we have issues with people who don't look like us in this country. We always have. It's a flaw of ours. But the Chinese, they have a different culture. They have a different religion. They have different, their language is much different than ours. Their writing is much different than ours, alphabet and all that. And they're going to have to deal with the discrimination. As far as the European settlers, it's got their Scandinavians hit the northern plains, and Irish immigrants, German immigrants. The railroad played a big role in that. Again, there's a passage in your textbook that talks about this, the fact that the railroad was encouraging settlement in the West because they owned a lot of the land. Okay, 640 acres for every mile of track is what they were given in a lot of cases. Railroads are going to be the largest landowners outside the federal government. They're going to encourage settlement. And one of the ways they did that, they worked with steamship companies in Europe to bring settlers over from Europe, get them on the train, bring them straight to the West, and orchestrate a landing. I mean, they were offering special deals, bundles, if you will, for steamship service, railroad service, and then land. You bought from one company could handle all of that, and you got a better deal. They also offered credit options where you could, make payments on property, things that the different homestead acts and like. They didn't give you those options, and you could get more land from the railroad than you could from the government. But the European settlers, and again, the Scandinavian country is going to fill chunks and parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas. Again, read through that section in your text. Gives you a little more detail than that, but that's the main idea. But we're going to get all kinds of these groups heading west. Challenges, again, it's the isolation. You got to do without. You have to make your own. In some ways, you're kind of going back to a colonial period as settlers, because you're going out here into this vast open area, and in a lot of cases you were isolated away from towns, and you may be a half a day's ride from a town. Had to deal with the lack of there wasn't a lot of trees out in the Great Plains, so it wasn't like you were entering into the wilderness and you could build your log cabin. There's no logs, so they lived in the dugouts and the soddies. We watched the video that talked about that last week. Self-sufficient role of women. Again, it kind of goes back to that colonial time where the women handled everything in the house. They handled the raising of the children, the educating of the children. They had to make do with what was available. Technological innovations, it's the plow technology, reaper technology, portable windmills, barbed wire, all of these things that were going to be developed. Farming techniques are going to come as well. The Morrill Land Grant. We got to set up these agricultural colleges. Well, these colleges that were established were supposed to, continue the tradition of teaching science and the classical arts and military strategy, but they were also supposed to focus on agriculture and the mechanical arts. That's what a land grant school did. U of I is one of those. But we're supposed to be trying to learn and create and educate on better techniques. Department of Agriculture is going to be developed in this period as well, trying to encourage farming in those regions. One of the aspects of the farmers in the West that's going to eventually end up impacting our political system is that of these farmers' organizations. Groups like the National Grange, started in '67 by Oliver Kelly, partially because it was a need for the social. It was a chance for farmers to get together and talk about common problems and then find common solutions. Same with wives and children. It was an opportunity to bond, create friendships, share information, things like that. But they also began to, not only talk about their problems and how do you deal with it, but they also started developing their own solutions. Sometimes, maybe it's the way that they were supplied seed, or the way that they were buying or they're selling their grain and things like that. And they began to set up cooperatives where they're farmer owned, you're not profit driven, your break even is good. And it was about supplying the farmers with those services and those supplies that they needed, and doing it at a minimal cost. Doing it, in a way, they weren't trying to again make a profit off each individual farmer because they're not trying to make a profit off themselves. They just needed the service done. They just needed the supplies provided. From the national grange, we'll see other groups like the Farmers Alliance develop, Northern, Southern, and Colored, and eventually going to combine into one. But they're going to recognize the political power that they hold over the nation, or over politicians, with 4 million members. And it's from these Farmers Alliances as they begin to not only advocate policy but start looking at potentially running candidates that they start to develop into what we know as the Populist Party. Love this visual. It's just one of those. It's from Puck magazine, but you see this hot air balloon and the patchwork of it. What the Populist Party was able to do is take these groups like the Farmers Alliance, like the old Grangers, and throw in the Free Silver, the Prohibitions, the old Greenback, the Knights of Labor, the Socialists, the Communists, the Anarchists. A lot of these, again, there's a lot of political turmoil going on in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. There's a lot of people who are disgruntled with the government. But they don't have a large enough base to really be able to make the impact that they want. And the populists are going to find a way to bring all these little groups together. And these smaller groups are going to form the bigger party. And now they're going to be able to challenge the establishment. Radical ideas, direct election of senators, graduated income tax, secret ballots, term limits, all things that at the time were beyond people's comprehension. Because to do this, you're going to have amendments. I mean, there's in that small list I gave you, there's 3 things that are going to have to be amendments to the Constitution. You have to change our government system in order to make these things happen. You couldn't do it with just a law. That's radical. Again, we only had, at this point, 15 amendments. And the last time we saw, clusters of amendments being passed, it was Reconstruction. I mean, that was just dealing with the African Americans and slavery and citizenship and voting rights. Now we're talking about substantial changes to the system. So seen as radical because they were coming from outside the mainstream. And like we talked about in class, a lot of times the difference between an idea that is a radical idea and an idea that becomes a mainstream idea is time. Because these same ideas in, let's say, 20 years are going to be mainstream ideas. People have been talking about them for 2 decades, and now all of a sudden they understand it better. So the Populist Party in some ways is going to be a little ahead of their time. We're going to spend more time with the populists and the progressives during the next unit. Really the last industry we want to talk about, and just cover this briefly, we talked about the mining industry and how it helped establish our west to east settlement of our western territory. We talked about the cattle industry and how that's going to help settle that region. Now we've got the lumber industry. It's Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then Pacific Northwest. We're talking about Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and that area. It's a natural resource. We have all these trees. We need the wood for building projects. We need the wood for railroads. We need it for these homes, and the lumber industry is going to provide that, and they're going to utilize these natural, reoccurring raw materials. I have there the log flume with the ellipse after. That's what the picture is. And if you've ever ridden a log flume at an amusement park, it's the roller coaster in water. And that's a real thing the lumber mills would use to move wood, move logs across different areas. They would float those logs through those troughs. I mean, it's kind of a Roman aqueduct type system of elevations, and you get momentum going down the hill to go back up the hill, and but that's a real thing. But log towns would develop around the mills. And lumberjacks, they become the primary employer in these towns, and because they've got that kind of economic and political power, they're going to kind of run them. So the log towns develop much like the cow towns and the boom towns, and providing those services to the workers there. We watched the video on the Story of Us, and it did a little bit of work there, talked a little bit about the lumber industry as well. The last thing here is the idea of Alaska, and William Seward was our Secretary of State, and he's the one that's going to negotiate this deal, and he's the one that's going to convince the Congress that we needed to buy Alaska. Again, most people thought it was a stupid idea. They called it Seward's Folly, they called it Seward's Icebox, and a lot of other names too. But we paid $7.2 million for Alaska. Now, again, if you don't know this, Alaska is enormous. Okay? It dwarfs Texas in size. So the price is actually a good price. I mean, it's less than 2 cents an acre. But we just didn't understand what was there. And in 1880, boom, we discover gold. Guess what? Now we've also discovering, hey, there's a thriving fur industry, or the potential for a thriving fur industry. Okay, we've got the fishing industry, not just in crabbing, which we've seen on the TV shows, but we're also talking about fishing as well. Copper mines, coal mines, timber. Okay, I mean, again, you got virgin forests up there. And, oh, by the way, we're going to discover oil too. We are more than going to make up that $7.2 million cost. But, I mean, I've joked about it in class that, we're talking about the different TV shows from Discovery Channel and History Channel with, with fur trappers and fishermen and gold miners and things like that out of Alaska still. It's still the final American frontier.